I'm still concerned about that. Now, there also a global development crisis in the sense that if you look at the income and wealth distribution, you see basically, before it was just a wine glass, it became a champagne glass, and it was, and not only that, the poverty reduction, and it happened because of the process of growth. Growth always leads to poverty reduction at some point, but the poverty reduction was based on the growth that was based on an integration and those economic and environmental imbalance that were not sustainable. So at some, basically what you're saying, well, growth was reduced in some countries, and poverty was reduced in some countries, but that was related to something that was not sustainable. In a nutshell, I think that the world was in the brink of a crisis anyways. And when I talked to Ha-Joon, I said, well, the worst about that is that those imbalances are so integrated that whatever it started, and I thought it would start at the financial, and I explained to Ha-Joon why, it would create a vicious circle. Because the bicycle, once the bicycle falls in the financial sector, and you start a process of deleveraging, which means that destruction of the structure that allow for the financing of this bicycle, then you have an direct impact on trade, economic output, and that goes feedbacks into finance. And the poor countries that were already having political unrest because of these inequalities that remained, tend to become more political and stable. And politically stable environments are detrimental to economic and social development. This is the third phase that we're going to see now, when the political unrest is going to start affecting development, is going to affect international trade, is going to affect, this is going to be self-fulfilling. Now, having said that, let's talk about the response. I'm I'm Keynesian since I was a kid. I think I was born a Keynesian.
Yeah,
but
Brazil is so advanced that they teach Keynesian economics in primary school.
Well, I first started with Marx and went to Schalatek and then became a Keynesian, but I'm a little bit of a mixture of all that, thanks God. Are we all Keynesians now? No, I'm not Keynesian. And I'll have to explain to you. Keynesian policies were a best fit for an environment of 5 minutes, of limited trade and no international finance. As a matter of fact, Keynes did all the best he could in the Bretton Woods discussions to basically avoid financial liberalization and the way that we saw, the financial globalization the way we saw. Because he was basically saying, well, in order to have national response of aggregate demand expansion, you have to be able to control the effects on both the leakage on trade, but also on the leakage on capital outflows. So what happened in 30 years is the process of trade integration and the dependence of the bicycle on this integration is so significant, and the dependence on the financial globalization and the financial integration is so significant that the space for the national response using traditional Keynesian policies is very limited, at least in the short run. Now, this explains a little bit the thing that why they introduced the Buy American clause in the discussions, or why there's a tendency for protectionism. There's an email going around which is a joke saying, the guy making an analysis, a fiscal analysis, said, well, okay, every dollar that I receive probably either is going to 80 cents is going to China to buy this, or 20 is going to that to buy. Nothing is going back to America because the trade leakage are so significant. Now, what we really need is to find a way to, if you want policies that are consistent to can resume growth, we have to find policies that at the same time you have an increasing aggregate supply and aggregate demand on the same geographical space. On the same geographical space. That means, for instance, that it's not enough for China to continue industrialize. It has to industrialize, but also create the mechanism to include the 8 million people into the market, which has economic, but social and political consequences, but has to be done. Because otherwise, you can use your reserves to improve your infrastructure, but at the end of the day, your infrastructure investment is dependent on the aggregate demand that you have outside your space. I'm just talking about China, but what I basically wanted to say is that The only way I can perceive that if for developing countries, if you have the possibility and the instruments to increase aggregate demand from within, and there's a lot of space for that because social exclusion has been part of the development process in the last 3 decades, and but you have also to have mechanisms to control on international trade and capital flows. Now, to conclude, there are only 2 ways at the moment that I can see, but I'm just sharing with you my astonishment. And this is going to be shocking, Ha-Joon. You either go towards full globalization, which means no protectionism, total and fair international trade, which means being opening up and taking advantage of the competitive advantage of different countries and favoring those countries that are at different stages of development, having a truly fair international trade. You have to have international mechanism of total control of capital flows on global level. You have to have global institutions and global governance. Are we prepared for that? No, we're not. And we see the discussion. I participate in the discussion. The D20, the understanding of the leaders of the crisis is significant, the need to be more cooperative and so on. But when you try to explain to the German taxpayers that they need to put money in developing countries in order to maintain aggregate demand for German industry, that's it. It doesn't fly. So, but I have to, as a representative of developing countries in the World Bank, I have to be pushing towards that. That's the way. The other possibility is going the other way around. It's by establishing mechanisms of control, like on trade and capital flows in developing countries, and try to do not only through the industrialization, but also at the same time expanding aggregate supply by creating more diversified productive capacity, but also increasing aggregate demand in process of social and economic inclusion. And that, for instance, conditional cash transfer programs like the one in Brazil have been useful. They would have to be intensified, and at the same time we have one or the other. Problem that I have with that, few developing countries can do that. The countries that have the instruments, for instance, that have national development banks, huge, and that have already established social net, safe nets and cash transfer programs, countries that are huge enough to say, okay, I'll keep on expanding my aggregate demand, and by the way, I'm going to establish the control. Most of developing countries, particularly the poorest ones, have none of those instruments. So my concern is, my astonishment is that this is to pull it out. Either we fully cooperate as global citizens, and we move towards full globalization, which is political, not viable, or we go towards some kind of autarky with social inclusion and industrialization adaptation. But again, several people will go to
on what the Earth can bear, and particularly in terms of looking into stimulus and how we should get the global economies in track. We should obviously do that in such a way that we are not deepening the climate crisis that we are already facing, but are using the funds in a way to push us into a further low-carbon economy. And that has to be done both in the developed countries that are very much resisting still, but even more importantly also in the developing countries. And there is then the question of where the finance for that has to come from. With that.